Okay, we'll open the April 24th meeting of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board here in the elegant Riesling Room. And that seems like there should be a little band playing or something in the back. I'll get that, but it's great.
Get on that, Liz.
I'll get that set. Great. So let's go ahead and start with board member comments. And who looks least ready? Bob.
Perceptive. Well, I'm Bob Weber. I represent ODFW on the OWEB board. I'm not seeing anybody I'm not really talking to here, other than the board. Well, the public was not. I didn't see public around. But we, as all the agencies are currently, is trying to shepherd our budget through, and it's moving along. Probably of more interest is that we just had a meeting last Friday where we started taking public comments on our draft wolf management plan with some modifications. That's always interesting because I'm not, having sat through 3-4 hours of testimony, I didn't see that there was much meeting of the minds between the ag community and the real conservative conservationists. Some of the stuff we're dealing with is the Oregon, or the Army Corps of Engineers has decided recently that they're going to put out bids for their hatchery production in terms of their mitigation obligations. In the past, ODFW has always done it. Now they're saying, well, we're going to take bids and see who's going to do it cheapest. Excuse me. So we're kind of working through that because we do have facilities and people that are involved in that would be hard pressed to I would feel very badly if we didn't win the bid. I think the last time we met, we were talking about the Columbia River fishery management. Back in January, we took a vote. After we voted, the governor indicated that our vote was not acceptable to her. And so we had to go back in March and reconsider it. And I think we landed way closer to what she wanted than where we had been. So I think hopefully that will make folks happy. And I don't know if anybody here has any interest in kind of the concepts that we deal with there, like with the Columbia River management. I'm sure Rosemary understands it all. But it's mainly dealing with the allocation of the fish between commercial fishing and recreational fishing. Everybody is always talking about we want to save the fish, but the reality is that we're just splitting up the allocation of ESA listed fish, and when we split, or the allocation is how many we can kill. So it doesn't matter who's getting 50%, it's a 50-50, 80-20, the fish are still done. So it's kind of a political argument as opposed to a science. It's not science, it's who are we giving it to, and that created a lot of interest and controversy. Other than that, I think we've had quiet times.
Alan?
We've had quiet times too. Not really. Times are changing. Gosh, what can I say? I can't. Now, right now, we're looking at putting systems in place to meet the White House's proposed budget as we're part of the executive branch. And that budget actually represents about a $2.4 billion cut, about 2,300 staff cut. I don't think anybody believes that that's going to be the end budget. I think we all know that there's probably going to be a different budget that we'll have to work to, but at this point in time, we have to work towards that budget, look at what programs will end up getting cut and how many people will have to get cut. I know right now we're looking at accelerating a buyout program for staff, and I haven't looked closely at it, so I'm not sure what that means in terms of what it represents for people who have the right time and right grade in. But I've heard that it represents a $40,000 buyout for moving ahead and retiring early. And I'm not sure how many people they're going to try to how many people they will try to get to take those buyouts, and then what happens after that. I think there's just a lot of uncertainty, and so we're not sure what direction we're going to go in, and we won't until we know what the budget's going to be like, the 2018 budget's going to be like. We're operating under, as all programs in the federal agency, we're operating under a continuing resolution, and that ends at the end of this week, and people are betting that it's going to continue, and probably will continue. People are betting it's going to continue through throughout the entire fiscal year. We don't know. We're operating on last year's budget and hoping we're doing the right thing, because we could get another budget that comes out as part of the continuing resolution that's less than what we are spending right now, so we could be in a tight situation if that happens. There was recently a ruling from the district court on the TMDL, or on the temperature standard, the natural condition criterion. I think at the last board meeting, I had mentioned that it was invalidated initially, and the district court came out and confirmed that invalidation. What it does mean is that EPA or the Willamette TMDL for mercury has to be done within 2 years. The temperature TMDL for the Klamath Basin will have to be done in 2 years, and that 10 of the major TMDLs that have been done. And when I say a major TMDL, I'm talking about a TMDL that represents a lot of small TMDLs. And so one TMDL package may represent hundreds of TMDL or hundreds of 303D listed waters. So it's a big piece of work no matter how you look at it. But 10 of those packages are looking to have to be redone, but we're not sure how long. They didn't define the time frame for those 10 TMDLs. And we're not sure what standard to use, because the biologically based numeric criterion is a standard that we're being forced into, but when we have natural conditions that are higher than that, it's kind of hard to develop a TMDL to meet the biologically based numeric criterion when you can't get there. And so we're trying to figure that out. In fact, today I was on a call with, listening on to a whole bunch of attorneys from all over the place talk about how to address this, and there's no surefire answer to addressing this. And that's it.
Well, if the attorneys can't figure out the science, who's going to?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Kathy?
Good afternoon, Kathy Stengel, Bureau of Land Management. So we too are waiting on the budget, kind of anxious to see what this week brings, so a lot of unknowns there. But we have our new state director in place, Jamie Connell, and she's been there about a month, which is great, so we're trying to set things in place. We have a new acting director for BLM. His name is Mike Ned, and a new deputy, John Roos. So those are kind of temporary places till we get a director in place. So we're still moving forward in Oregon and Washington for the BLM as in regards to our annual work plan. So really focusing on land use planning in Washington, the San Juans, and southeastern Oregon. Also implementing the sage-grouse plans that we amended last year, as well as the Western Oregon RMP. And then really focusing on, we have a lot of energy projects coming our way. So that will be a big focus in the near future. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Stephen?
Steve Brandt, representing Oregon State University Extension. I don't have anything specific about Extension, but I'll just say three things about the university. Just last week, the Board of Trustees approved a 4% increase in tuition for undergraduates, resident undergraduates, and 2% for non-residents. And that's going to be used in part to sort of help offset some of the increased PERS and salary costs. But President Reyes said that 25% of that will be devoted towards helping students in need, who need financially. The second item is it's actually good news. There's a Center for World University Rankings, which ranked universities across 5 continents, and Oregon State ranked number 2 in forestry worldwide and number 3 in oceanography. And that's on the basis of research articles published in top-tier scientific journals. So that's good news. And third, we just got an email today announcing that Oregon State's now going to have a new logo. And so it's kind of fun. I'm looking at it. There's at least 8 different things on it. There's a beaver, of course. There's something to represent the Land, Sea, Sun, and Space grant, which the university is only one of 2 in the country that has all 4 of those. Cornell's the other one. There's something representing the ocean, the trees, and forests and mountains and so forth. So you'll be seeing that soon, I'm sure, at every time you see a university presentation. That's all I've got.
Great, thanks. Go Beavs, as I say. Get that. Okay, Jason gets extra time to give us his entire life history.
Oh, fantastic.
Our new member.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Jason Robinson, and I represent Tribal Interest. And I do want to say thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to work on the board and represent Tribal Interest. I'm very happy and honored to be here representing Tribal Interest and being endorsed by most of the Oregon tribes. So I look forward to serving in this role. I want to say thank you to Mr. Quemps, who in his tenure has done some great things for Oregon tribes and tribes in general. And I think that his work, his tenure here is very important, and he leaves some very big shoes to fill. So I'm looking forward to stepping in those shoes and seeing how I can proceed and move that work forward. I want to thank MEDA, and I want to thank the executive committee, the executive team at OWEB. It's amazing what kind of staff we have to work with here, and I was very honored to be able to visit them and do my onboarding. It's a great process, and I really appreciate the staff taking the time to bring me up to speed. Really appreciate that. As I work through with the board, I'll be focusing on the continued outreach and communication with tribes, and I hope to increase tribal involvement, awareness, in OWEB projects and programs, and try to get more tribes involved in general conversations with project proponents as well. I think tribes bring a unique perspective to the table. They look at things, kind of the 3 pillars of sustainability, looking at the social, ecological, and economic, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity for tribes to serve kind of in the center as we bring different diverse groups together. So I think tribes have a tremendous role in the OWEB process, and I want to make sure to continue to invite them to the table. As part of my commitments to OWEB, I've decided to participate as well in this monitoring subcommittee and the FIP subcommittee, and I'm looking forward to serving in that capacity and working with OWEB staff on those subcommittees. And I'm really looking forward to the agenda over the next couple of days. So what I understand is I'm jumping into a really hectic agenda, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the OWEB process, the board process, and getting more involved. And I think this is the agenda to do it. So I'm looking forward to the discussions over the next couple of days. And once again, thank you. And I look forward to working with each and every one of you around the table.
Great, welcome. That's great. Randy, do you want to go now, or do you want to?
Randy Labby, Public at Large from Portland. I don't have any board comment, but that's worthy, but that doesn't keep me from saying something. I had 8 winter steelhead fly fishing trips planned this winter. 6 were canceled because the rivers were blown out, and 1 should have been canceled because the rivers had been blown out. And then I had 1 memorable day on the coast. So, Bob, the winter steelhead fish have not been harassed at all this winter. They're going to spawn without much interception, which is good.
Well, I can say they were harassed. I don't know if they were harassed because I never saw one, but I was throwing stuff out there trying to talk to them.
I very rarely harass one, but still I go out.
Okay. John, why don't we go from?
Yeah, I guess I have to commiserate with Randy and Bob. I had a couple steelhead trips canceled too. It was more rain than I wanted to deal with. But John Roberts, representing the Oregon Water Resources Commission and Department, and tonight for our dinner guests, Director Tom Byler will be here, and Alyssa Muckin who's working on the Integrated Water Resource Strategy update. So I'll let them go into some of the details tonight about that. But I thought you might be interested in the see my latest water conditions report through the department as of April 17th. I think it states the obvious. At present, the state is up to about, varies from 152% of normal on snowpack in the Willamette Basin and Lake County, down to the lowest in the Owyhee Basin of 109%. So it's pretty good news all the way around. And overall, the whole state's up about 130% of normal. During the next couple of weeks, the forecast is for below average temperatures and above average precip, as most of us have experienced. And so the 3-month outlook from NOAA indicates equal chance of above or below temperatures and precip. And they are also, the Climate Prediction Center is also forecasting the onset of an El Nino in the fall of 2017, which generally brings warmer and drier conditions to the Pacific Northwest. So we'll see how that unfolds. But the good news right now, and the reason us fishermen are not fishing, is that statewide stream flows for the month of March were 230% of normal. So that kind of takes care of the sporting part of it. And it's very interesting about the various snowpacks in the basins, but the Rogue, where I live down in Jacksonville, is about 137% of normal right now on snow water equivalent. Willamette's 157. And the only one below 100% on snow water equivalent is the Owyhee, and at 88%. But it looks like, you know, to our nice surprise, the Owyhee reservoir may virtually fill this year, where, you know, going into the fall, we thought there's no chance because it was at the low point. So very good news for the state on all fronts as far as the water for this year. So it seems like the legislatures had a wake-up call too, because they're paying attention to some of the issues surrounding water management more than they used to. So it'll be interesting to get an update from Director Byler tonight as far as what on the budget. But Water Resources has been treated quite favorably so far, at least on the budget. So
Great.
that's enough.
Nice. Rosemary.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Rosemary Furphy, and I'm with the National Marine Fisheries Service. Glad to give a quick update. I've been mentioning the NMFS-led Columbia Basin Partnership Task Force, and that had its second meeting last week. And that brings together all the different interest groups, including some of the ones that are both commercial fishery, recreational fishery, but that's trying to look at a comprehensive Columbia Basin-wide effort to understand all those competing interests moving forward. I'm working with other staff to respond to public comments on the 2 Snake River recovery plans that do include parts of Northeast Oregon. So that's Snake River Fall Chinook, Snake River Spring Summer Chinook, and Steelhead. Those comment period have closed, and those recovery plans will be finished by the end of September. We are also working closely with co-managers on hatchery impacts to Fall Chinook, which is a key issue, being that many of the Fall Chinook returning to the Snake River Basin are hatchery fish. So trying to better understand that composition to protect natural origin fish. At our last meeting in January, I mentioned we have a new West Coast Regional Administrator. His name is Barry Thom. And since our last meeting, I'm pleased to say that Scott Rumsey is now our acting Deputy Regional Administrator for the West Coast region. And Scott previously coordinated Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund, so he's very familiar with OWEB and our program here, which I think is very much to our advantage. Maida, Renee, and I met with Barry Thom and Scott Rumsey on February 27th, and Maida and Renee did a great job introducing the OWEB program and introducing themselves to Barry and hearing about his interests, and Scott was at that meeting as well. So I think, again, a very favorable impression to NMFS by the OWEB staff and leadership here. Following a little bit on what Alan was talking about regarding the new administration in DC, we don't have any announcements. We have a Commerce Secretary, but no announcement yet as far as our NOAA administrator or the head of the National Marine Fisheries Service, and I'll certainly keep you posted. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Gary.
Gary Marshall, member at large. First of all, welcome aboard, Jason. My comments are going to be probably the same you've heard before, and that's about High Desert Partnership, and it's what's going on with it in Harney County. It's growing, expanding. Our initiatives are working well, and large part through the funding that we get from OWEB. The Harney Basin Wetlands Initiative has put on 2 staff. That brings the staff for High Desert Partnerships up to 4. That's something like the ratio of the value of that workforce to Portland would be something like 600 jobs or something like that. So in Harney County. So it's really the need has outgrown the capacity right now is basically where we're at on that. So we're working to try to fill that gap. We have a number of different initiatives from wildland fire to positive youth initiatives. So forests and wetlands, and of course the ones we started out with is still alive, and that's the 15-year conservation plan with the refuge. So it's pretty busy. One other thing, the governor came to town 2 weeks ago and she spent the day over there and visited schools, and she attended our Positive Youth Initiative meeting and met with High Desert Partnership Board and local community response team, and spent the whole day over there. It was really positive. I thought we had some really good dialogue, so appreciated that.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Laura.
All right. Are these just on? Yeah, okay. All right, so Laura Masterson, Oregon Department of Agriculture. We too are deep in budgeting over there. And I think from my perspective, I wanted to make a little shout out for all the work that OWEB and especially Maida did on the Oregon Ag Heritage Program. So hopefully that's moving forward through the legislature. That's basically the funding for the conservation easements on Oregon ag land. And I know it's a hard it's a hard legislative cycle for anything that needs a little extra money, but hopefully we'll be able to get that one through and keep the good partnership that started over here, and I think is also with anyway, a great combo of farmers and conservation groups. Hopefully we can keep that moving forward. At our last board meeting, we talked a lot about water quantity and quality, and we just put out our State of Oregon Ag 2017. So if anybody wants to look that up, it's of course online. And one of the big issues, I mean, there's a lot of issues in ag, but the most relevant one I think to OWEB is about water quantity and quality. And maybe the only other thing I wanted to mention was, just that I hope everybody's met our fabulous new director, Alexis Taylor. So we're super excited about her, and anyway, the sort of new perspective she brings to Oregon Ag. And anyway, we miss Katie, and we're excited about Alexis. So.
Where did Alexis come from?
Well, she originally came from the Midwest.
Okay.
She grew up, her family does corn and soybeans, I think. And then she was in the military. She worked for various senators from Montana, and she was most recently at USDA. So, and then to Oregon. So yeah, she has a lot of diverse experience, I think, and she's interested in bringing some new stuff to the department that I think will be interesting. Just more women farming, veterans farming. Trying to get the department maybe a little more involved in youth and agriculture. But then she has the whole kind of international trade perspective, and anyway, so she's been a sport about, jumping right in to the legislature. Anyway, and I think she's really excited about trying to get in the first year, get to all the Oregon counties. So hopefully she'll be out to see you guys soon too. All right. Anyway, thanks.
Will.
Will Newhouser, Public at Large member. I'm out of Yamhill with nothing to report from there. My only report would be 2 weeks ago, I testified in front of the legislature in support of the OWEB budget. There were a lot of outside groups supporting as well. Very few questions. Everybody was supportive. I thought Senator Fredericks, who was chairing, was one of the more engaged members that I've seen. They often get distracted with other stuff, but he seemed fully attentive the entire time, as dull as we may have been. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for showing up at that. That's great. So it's Dan Thorndike, Ashland. Well, it's also been it was a cool and rainy March in southern Chile, so that's like September. So I'm totally confused, coming back from cool and wet to cool and wet, and fall and spring actually look alike too. So it's kind of confusing. But since then, I've seen a lot of snow skiing 5 or so times since I got home, and birding over in the Klamath Basin. A lot of birds, a lot of water. So that's kind of a nice change. And then skiing up a crater, a lot of snow, and they're supposed to get 2 to 3 feet more this week. So that's kind of a nice April. So that's good. And on the other front, I did get to we have a science museum down there, hands-on science museum called Science Works, and they do sort of these science pub talks. In the last pub talk they just had was the Nature Conservancy folks on the Ashland Forest Restoration Project, and a lot of, this was their chief scientist on that project, and a lot of issues talking about basically meshing restoration with climate change and all of the issues that presents, and it really was a very interesting presentation, and I think it basically reinforced a lot of the stuff we've been talking about over the years here in terms of restoring for functionality rather than necessarily restoring to somebody's perceived notion of what it used to be like, and a lot of papers cited on that and a lot of interesting stuff about really just trying to get a functioning mosaic of multi-aged trees, et cetera, that should be able to help withstand the impacts of climate change, and once they're able to actually restore a fire regime. So, but it was really quite a good presentation, and I think the turnout even surprised them on that. There were a lot of people who showed up and seemed very interested in the project. So, and there was some nice shout outs to the OWEB participation on that. So it's kind of nice for the community. So I think that's it. And I think now we have Maida with the blue book, and then move on.
Yes, so I'm just going to walk you through your blue folders. First on the, actually before I start there, we are making a general change, and so I'm going to remind you of this now, and then we will remind you of it often. I'm sure the co-chairs will. We are shifting to audio-only minutes, starting with this meeting. So you have minutes here to approve for this meeting, but after that we'll be going to audio-only, which means we are asking that you remember to introduce yourself as often as you can when you're speaking. We'll also be reminding folks coming up to testify. So I think it's fine if Randy or Dan or Will introduce you by name and call on you by name. That's fine. You don't need to reintroduce yourself. But if they don't, it would be nice if you would say your name as you start your comments so we can follow along with those. So that will be a change in the future. So just keep that in mind. And that also means put your mics by your mouths when you're talking, and we will all do a good job of reminding each other of that.
Can I say somebody else's name?
Yes, you can absolutely say somebody else's name. They need to sound fairly close to you, though. So you can't pick Kathy, for example. Then on top of your blue folder, there is a little sheet that has directions, this little tiny. Please pay attention for leaving here this evening. Traffic gets really bad on the highway out there, and so it's nearly impossible to take a left-hand turn. Apparently, according to Derica, this is where all the accidents occur, and we really need a quorum, so we don't want you going down that way in the evening. Use these directions to get back down through West Salem to the hotel. Inside your blue folder, on the left-hand side, a reminder of the voting rules. Again, they're quirky, and we have both funding and non-funding items. So we will be looking at those if we have any votes, which we may have that are split votes. We will be paying attention to that for our funding decisions. Behind that is the latest staffing list, phone numbers, which has been requested in the past. So that's our latest updated list. Moving to the right-hand side of the folder, the first thing you'll find in your packet is a little OWEB strategic planning. This is the themes from the interviews that you all did in February. You do not need to read this in advance of the conversation on Wednesday, but some folks like to. So they are going to walk through this with you on Wednesday, but we wanted to make sure that you had it in hand in case you wanted to spend a little bit of time with that information ahead. Following that are the proposed board motions, if anybody is so inclined, including any changes to motions if we have adjustments. And then following that are a series of written comments that were received. So the first is around our coastal wetlands grants. There are a couple of comments there for you to look at. And when we get to those sections, Eric Williams will be bringing you back to these, but just so you know they're in here. Comments about the Tillamook Estuaries project, and then written comments on open solicitation grant awards. We have a few of those. A number of written comments on land acquisition grant awards. That's with the orange. Moving next to the pink, there are some general public comments. One of those is in response to the rulemaking, but it is not specifically a rulemaking comment. So it's a general comment that came back in response to rulemaking. And then a few other, again, general comments. And then following that, so just white page, are the funding conditions for our acquisition grants. So when we get to that point, Eric, again, will be referring you to these funding conditions. And then the last two items are two other business items that are very brief, and we will describe them when we get there, but if you want to look in advance, we do have two other business items. So a number of things in your blue folders. you have questions about those, let me know. But I think that's it.
So Randy Labby, Public at Large member. If you were able to drag or carry your materials book into the meeting, please turn to tab B, and you'll find the last written, or the minutes of the meeting in Madras, January 24th. And I'm asking for either some amendments or corrections, additions, deletions, or a motion to approve.
Will Newhouser move to approve. the
Dan
minutes.
Thorndike, second.
Any questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried.
I just want to abstain because I wasn't there.
Okay. Record will show.
Yeah, that was Laura.
Messed it up already.
It's good to have you back, Laura.
It's good to be back.
Okay, we'll go to item C. I get to commit co-chairicide, which is great on that. And that's, it's now time to we have this sort of process of having rotating co-chairs. And my time is up. Now, the good news is I get to say all the stuff that I didn't feel was appropriate as co-chair. The good news for everybody else is I don't really remember what I was going to say about that stuff, so I should be safe on that. But in any event, I don't know if you wanted to give background on that, Maida, or? Okay, all right.
Yeah, as Dan said, that we're set to rotate, and since OWEB's inception, there's been this policy of rotating on having 2-year terms that are staggered, and there's been some research into filling this position, which is incredibly difficult. But we have a target, and he is equally as skilled, and I've enjoyed working with him throughout the years and other issues, and I'd like to ask for a nomination.
Co-chair, I would, this Bob Weber, I would move the board elect Will Newhouser to serve as OWEB board co-chair for a 2-year term. And that's based on the fact I've seen him stagger before, so it will be appropriate.
Dan Thorndike, I second that.
So we have a nomination and a second, and we'd like to have a motion now.
That's a vote.
That's the motion. Okay. Any question? Any further comment?
Rosemary Furphy, I certainly strongly support Will and appreciate all his insights and long service on the board, and will bring great perspective to it. So thank you for your willingness to serve.
Any other comments? Okay, question's been called. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
I would note there's also an informal policy that one of the co-chairs has to be named Dan, so I've got my name change paperwork right here.
Here we go. Boom. Okay.
Well, we'll have an opportunity to say goodbye to Dan later. I think that one of the comments will come up that there's nobody with greater institutional memory of this organization than Dan. I don't know if there's any in the past with greater, but I can't imagine that. And so it's going to take some big shoes, big feet to fill those shoes. Alan?
Randy, this is Alan Henning. That's weird, but got to get used to saying that. Dan, how much longer are you going to be serving on the board then?
Maida, much longer am I doing?
Depends. No, his term will be up at the end of this year in December. And from the staff's perspective, I ditto what Randy said. There are a few people on staff with more institutional memory than Dan, and we are thrilled to have him continue to stay on the board after coming off as co-chair.
Okay. Subcommittee updates. Eric? Oh, I'm sorry, Will. Your first duty as co-chair is to report on the folks' investment committee.
Get to my notes. So, Will Newhouser, recent past chair of the FIP subcommittee as of 5 minutes ago, I guess. So we met, most of the work on the committee was reviewing status. You've got the report in the binder in section D, first page. The implementation status, there's a lot of detail, but basically it appears most things are pretty well on track for their completing basically the first year of business. There's a lot of info later, but the groups are all underway. There's grant agreements being worked on for the next phase, figured out what might have to carry over for the next biennium, where not all the dollars were allocated into projects fast enough in the first biennium. Getting ready for the next round of solicitation. So that process of revising the process and applications is going on, and making good progress in the capacity building FIPS apparently, and BEF is will be reporting out on some monitoring work, which we'll hear more about under the monitoring section, I believe. And I will say the first preview that we got of some of the sort of more comprehensive monitoring system for the FIPS is quite interesting. It's the so-called results chain stuff. And hopefully it's not more complicated than it's worth, but it certainly looks like an interesting mechanism to be trying out and see whether that pans out. So other than that, unless there are questions, Alan?
This is Alan. Just a thank you to Eric and Andrew for all the work they've been doing, specifically with the FIPS on moving their projects forward. All the reports we've been getting back have been very, very positive. The support that you guys have been giving those folks to keep them on track and helping them out and get things going. And that's really important for the FIP program. So thanks for all of your effort. And Maida and Renee, thank you guys too for keeping those guys going as well. So.
Rosemary, monitoring.
Rosemary Furphy with the monitoring subcommittee report. You have the update in your board packet. I will just highlight that the committee's been very active. We've met twice since our last board meeting in February, and then again just recently 2 weeks ago in April. We've been working closely with Renee on developing monitoring guidance for the development of the work plan that's going to be revising the monitoring guidance for monitoring grants. And we also received a report on the CREP program, the effectiveness monitoring study, and you will be receiving a report on that today, but we got a preview, which was very interesting. And then we've been talking about other monitoring efforts that are also happening, and then highlighting what we will be bringing forward to the board in the coming, for the rest of the year really, including this board meeting's report on the CREP effectiveness monitoring progress, as was just mentioned, on the Bonneville Environmental Foundation progress on monitoring of the FIPS. That'll be in July. And then some Tidegate monitoring, and then the John Day intensively monitored watershed in next January. So again, looking ahead and trying to keep track of all these various monitoring efforts, and want to thank the committee members.
Any questions? Bob?
No, I don't have a question, but is it my turn now?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Okay. In regard, Bob Weber, in regard to the open solicitation subcommittee, you got the right up in the pocket, and I think Eric did a great job of capturing what we were doing. The three areas, it seems like the committee just is a make-work project for OWEB staff. We were looking at the small grant program, $10,000 cap. Staff was charged with looking at that, seeing what's being funded, seeing how many run up against the cap, and giving us some feedback so that we can then hopefully recommend to the board to keep the cap or to raise it, and if so, how much. Outreach application review, another process that staff is dealing with, to create an application that more nearly reflects what we can fund in regard to our funding source through the lottery. We have restrictions, and unfortunately we haven't been real good at following those restrictions, and so we're redoing the application so that the applicants can better conform to what we are able to do. And we're also looking at, when you went through the open solicitations, we wanted to at least look at the funding line process and see if there's something that we think might be better in how we reach that and how we can adjust it. Any questions?
Okay, thanks, Bob. Oh, Alan?
What were you considering as a bump in the increase on the small grants? Or is that just?
Well, we hadn't really come up with an amount. I think the only one that jumps into my mind is it seems like we might have thrown out up to 25,000, but there's been no decisions made where we are.
Okay.
Real quick question, Jason Robinson. So is my understanding then that the increase in that OWEB small grants amount would be to satisfy some need that we're not meeting with the $10,000 shortfall for specific projects, for example?
Correct. That's a Bob Weber again. Jason, that's a long-standing cap, and we just thought it was time to take a look at it and see if it's still appropriate, and if not, what it should be in our minds.
Thanks, Bob.
Any more? Then we'll move to agenda item E, which is public comment. I don't see any yellow slips up here. Is there anybody? All right,
Okay.
excellent. So I've moved the schedule up by 30 minutes, Dan.
And now you can come up, Eric. Are you gonna? Item F, outreach rulemaking update.
This item specifically has public comment, so if anybody is here to comment on the outreach rulemaking, make sure you get a yellow card in.
Okay, thank you, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, my name is Eric Williams. I'm the grant program manager at OWEB. This item is on outreach rulemaking. If you'll recall, at the last board meeting, you authorized a work group that we formed to help us with the outreach application that Bob just described to become a rulemaking advisory committee, so that once we flesh out the content of an application, that group can then translate that into administrative rules that would replace the rules that we currently have. After passage of Measure 76, the statutes and program guidance that we have were amended to implement the changes from Measure 66, which is what Bob was describing. With regard to outreach, a significant change rendered education projects no longer eligible and required outreach projects to be, quote, necessary for carrying out eligible restoration and acquisition projects. At the time, we provided basic guidance about linking projects directly to restoration projects, but our application was not changed. The board did recognize the need to do this work at that time, but due to other major commitments, such as development of the long-term investment strategy, the board scheduled amending the outreach application for this current biennium. So you are on the schedule that you had initially laid out to do this work. The board's open solicitation subcommittee, as you just heard from Bob, included revising the outreach application among its top 4 priorities. With the directive to focus on stakeholder engagement, staff convened an outreach application work group comprised of outreach grant recipients from each OWEB region, as well as the executive directors of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils and the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. The work group has met 3 times and to date has developed a draft outreach application and intends to complete a final draft application by June. That group, I think, has done a great job on this. It's quite a challenging topic, and part of the work is envisioning eligible activities that perhaps haven't really been applied for by parties in the past. And as an example of that, the Coalition of Land Trust representative mentioned that even though it's been in our Measure 76 language in our statute, that outreach applications that are necessary for eligible acquisition projects are eligible for funding. They just simply hadn't really considered this source, I think mainly because of a feeling they thought that that was the purview of watershed councils. And so with this change, I think will come interest from parties that in the past have not been interested in outreach offering. Another example that I can give you that has been discussed in terms of what activities would be eligible is something similar to what's currently a technical assistance type project that deals with landowner engagement. That type of project is something we funded under technical assistance offerings for a long time and is designed to basically recruit landowners to have projects implemented on their properties within a watershed according to a watershed-based plan. There are similar needs to do that kind of stakeholder engagement with not only landowners but community members, other neighbors to a project site that aren't designed to necessarily recruit those people to have projects implemented on their property, but rather might be necessary for elevating knowledge and awareness about a needed restoration or acquisition project that some kind of stakeholder engagement is necessary to convey to those parties. So it's an initial step leading along the path toward, if it's a restoration project, toward then getting landowners on board, getting the project designed and built. Or if it's an acquisition project, helping perhaps neighbors, other community members understand the implications of that acquisition project. And in some cases, it might be for a restoration project, helping upstream or downstream members of the community understand, for example, what are the ramifications of doing a dam removal project on this stream? What things do we need to know about it to make people comfortable with that project going forward? So those are some types of activities that the work group has discussed that this application could potentially solicit. Another piece to this would be that the traditional technical assistance number 3 or landowner engagement type projects would be incorporated under this new offering. And so when we talk about the spending plan item tomorrow for open solicitation, we'll talk more about how we might address that in terms of our program offerings and the funding that we request to be put into each line item under open solicitation. I'm happy to answer questions about the effort.
Yeah, Dan?
Yeah, sort of. It's a funny kind of concept. I mean, I guess a bit that language when you think of in the discussion, is it that it needs to be tied to a specific project, or it can be a general category of eligible restoration or acquisition projects, or do you
Right.
need a project?
We talked quite a bit about that in the work group, both in terms of is it a specific project, and then in terms of temporally when might this happen. And as close as we got with that is a specific and reasonable time frame for restoration happening, and that implies, yes, knowing the geography where the project might occur, rather than some broader level. Maybe someday we'll get somebody interested, 5 years down the line somewhere, in a 6-digit Huck watershed. It has to be more targeted and specific than that. And I think that we had pretty good consensus on the work group about that.
I guess I might add, I can see the logic in that, given, the percentage of, we'll get more on the spending plan, but it's not a huge amount relative to, so I could see the benefit of focusing a bit. On one hand, you can go, it'd be wonderful to do great big long-term stuff, but again, there's not, historically, as I might remember institutionally, I'm not sure, but there was never enough money to do something really meaningful at a higher elevation level. So it seems like you're kind of weaving that together nicely.
And some of it is taking into account that there may be new types of activities that we hadn't funded before. Taking the education programs out of the mix changes the face of what we'd been doing in the past. And so the expectations on proportion of our spending plan might change along with the types of projects that we end up soliciting here.
By the way, that was Dan.
Any other questions of Eric? Yes.
Yeah.
Laura?
Laura Masterson. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the ag community was involved in the work group, if they were.
What we did to form the work group is we asked our regional program representatives to give us potential candidates from organizations who have successfully received outreach grants in the past. And we added the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, the Coalition of Oregon Land Trust, and we asked the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts if they wanted to be involved, and they declined. Mainly, I think, because they had not been heavily involved in these types of grants in the past. And so that was typically our window into the ag community for participating on work groups such as this one.
This is Maida. If I can respond a little bit more broadly, we have been involving the Oregon Farm Bureau at a broader level than this specific grant type in developing. We've had them both present at the Connect conference and then have had them provide some insight for our capacity grantees, specifically on outreach. And so while they were not involved in this, a lot of what they've been feeding us over the last year is what leads to this type of grant. The fact that when we're doing acquisition projects, we are not reaching out to the landowner community, neighboring landowners in the way that we would be expected to. So while they weren't on this specific work group, they have been in our ear a lot over the last year and a half about what landowner outreach needs to look like.
Great, thank you.
Randy?
Yeah, hold on just a second. Rosemary?
Quick question for Eric. Hi, Rosemary Furphy again. I know we're looking at outreach grants cycle funding tomorrow and the coming days. Is there anything from that process that is valuable for you as we move forward with these changes? Were we already starting to let people know that the outreach grants criteria will be changing, and any insights from that will help ease this transition that you're talking about?
I think that the transition is going to be quite a challenge for several organizations around the state that have relied upon outreach funding to fund education programs. When we talked within the work group about the measure language and the statutory language, we got to an understanding of what that language means and the implications of it. However, that doesn't mean it's easy to just quickly pivot. And so one of the things that we've done is working with Sean Morford, who's here from the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, is to help put together a funding strategy for those types of education programs, looking at potentially what's out there for private foundations, how the new outdoor school program is going to work that recently passed at the last election through a ballot measure, and some other guidance for those councils and other organizations who might need a little bit of help, guidance, or coaching on, for example, what's the best way to interface with a school district, a public school district, where they may not have had much of that in the past. How do those entities make their budgeting decisions for things like outdoor school or education programs? Who are the right contact people within school districts or schools that they should be talking to about this kind of work? So that's a start. We know that's not going to provide the answer fully for everyone, but our hope is that going forward, and as outdoor school becomes better defined in terms of its process, that there may be some other options available for people, combined with potential private funding.
Bob, did you have a question?
Well, comment and question. In regard to Bob Weber, in regard to Rosemary's question, in the subcommittee, we had broached the idea of changing the name so that they're not thinking it's what it used to be, that we'd retitle it and there would be less confusion. And then a question in regard to the work group and their concept of where these projects would be. Have we, or will we in the future maybe get some contact with the Department of Justice to make sure that what we're doing is consistent with Measure 76?
Yes, that's a good question, and that's something that our work group raised pretty early on in our process of meeting. First, they wanted us to reaffirm the directive from the Open Solicitation Subcommittee, which we did. But in addition to that, we felt that it would be beneficial for us to have a conversation with our attorney at the Department of Justice to get more of a legal opinion on that Measure 76 and statutory language governing outreach grants. And so we did follow up with our attorney about that, and she confirmed what the Open Solicitation Subcommittee said and what our directive and guidance had been to this work group, that language that's in Measure 76 does very clearly preclude education programs from eligibility of funding through OWEB's grant fund.
Any other questions for Eric? Yes, Alan.
This is Alan Henning. Eric, is that concept being applied to the grants we're looking at tomorrow?
No, it is not, because we did not solicit those with a revised application.
Okay.
However, I would say that over time, review teams have looked more closely at the touch, so to speak, that applications have on restoration, and I think you could debate whether or not some of these actually meet the standard, but since we did not change the solicitation, we didn't think it was fair midstream to apply new evaluation criteria to those applications.
Good, thanks.
Thank you, Eric, very much. Randy Lavey, co-chair. We're going to step back and have a public comment from Claire Clock.
It's on this topic.
Oh, okay, good. Oh, on this one. Yeah.
Excuse me. I didn't really follow the outreach working groups work.
Can you identify yourself for the record?
Excuse me. My name's Claire Clock. I with Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District and Clock Farm, and I'm coming from both the professional perspective and my personal perspective of 43 years with conservation education, the first 20 or so with child or primary education, and then the last 17 years with conservation district and adult education. And we're looking at the outreach programs that are being discussed today, and it was sort of a blow in with Measure 76 and saying that we couldn't have education programs with OWEB. I understand that, but what we're talking about here is we're talking about PR. It's PR for the practices that we do, and now that there's an acquisition aspect to the OWEB thing, that's a PR that not only before I became a part of the conservation district, it was just as a professional, that's basically what I was getting the information from, and it wasn't really going out to the general public, and that's what we really need to do, is we need to go out to the general public. So it's not necessarily education or outreach for education, it is really PR for the conservation practices and the long-term aspects that we have going forth with conservations in general. And that would be about it. Thank you.
Any questions for Claire? Yeah, Alan.
I hear what this is Alan Henning. I hear what you're saying, but I think what Eric was saying allows for some of those opportunities to take place that you're talking about, where it is kind of an outreach element to go out to an area where a FIP's going to be implemented, or where there's a new project coming into place. And so I think that over time we'll begin to know what that definition truly stands for, but at least what I was hearing is there's going to be some opportunities for that.
No, I want to say that I support this. That's, if haven't been clear in that, that's exactly what we need to do, is to support the working group and the types of things that they do, so that we do get this word out, not just to the professionals or not just to the people that are interested in natural history, but the general public. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I think you bring up a really good point that I hope is addressed in our new strategic plan, and that is how to get more information to the public, as opposed not to deny our partners, but to broaden the scope of our profile with the general public. Randy Labby, co-chair, and due to the co-chair's exceptional time management, we have an opportunity to, with your forbearance, to take on a few tabs from tomorrow. And so if you can turn to tab K, we're going to go with a report on the legislative session and information on OWEB's budget, and then get to some FIPS monitoring. Renee and Eric.
Good afternoon, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director. So I'll start by walking us through the first section of item K1, budget and legislative update. So we, as many of the board members referenced during opening comments, we are in the thick of the budgeting process with the legislature. All is going well so far with us, but I'll start by just giving a quick reminder of the process that got us to where we are today, and then just give a brief update about the budget hearing that happened earlier this month, I guess it was. It feels like quite a long time ago. So attachment A outlines the components of OWEB's budget that are included in the governor's recommended budget. Mid 2016, we had submitted an agency request budget. The governor's office, along with Department of Administrative Services, contemplated what pieces of that the executive branch supported. And what you see in attachment A reflects where the governor landed in terms of our budget ask. So it does propose to retain 4 positions, 2 of which are focused on partnerships, one concentrating on the native fish FIPS, so Andrew Dutter's position. Another partnerships position focused on Coast Coho and Clean Water Partnerships, Jillian McCarthy's position. And then 2 positions focused on conservation outcomes, so really helping us to transition from measuring outputs to outcomes. Audrey Hatch is currently in the Conservation Outcomes Coordinator position. The specialist position we have held open until we have more clarity on the budget. And then we do also have funding included in the governor's budget for rental for the North Coast office that's now co-located with Dogami, as part of the relatively recent shift in staffing on the North Coast. It also includes a package focused on the Forest Collaborative's work, with us serving as the grant administrator for Department of Forestry and the program that they have in terms of Forest Collaborative's capacity. It does not include funding for the Oregon Ag Heritage Program. That was removed from OWEB's budget, but has a separate process that I think Eric and Maida will talk about, that's now going on a separate path through the legislative process. So we did mention in January that in addition to the governor's budget and the required 5 and 10% reductions, Legislative Fiscal Office did also request a 15% reduction, so we had updated you about that in January. At this point, no indication that that will be acted on. So earlier this month, we did begin our face time with the Natural Resources Subcommittee of Ways and Means. We had a 2-day budget hearing. We are small, and our hearings are short relative to some of our other natural resource agency partners. I think Fish and Wildlife may take nearly a whole week. So started off with simply a presentation about our budget that hits a lot of the required components that agencies must touch on during their budget presentations. Had good engagement, some questions from the subcommittee members, not an overwhelming number of questions, and no questions that were real stumpers for us. Did a little bit of follow-up on a few questions that had come up about salary increases and how that works broadly within the state, and then some of the economic benefit numbers that emerged several years ago from the University of Oregon study. Legislators are consistently quite interested in that. The second day of the budget hearing involved strictly public testimony, so thank you, now Co-Chair Newhouser, for coming and speaking on behalf of the board. We had a number of different local partners and organizations who came and talked about their experience with OWEB and the value of what OWEB enables around the state. Heard some stories, for example, from the Middle Fork of the Willamette and some of the specific projects that OWEB funding has helped support, and it really resonated with the members of the Ways and Means Subcommittee. I think they really like hearing those individual stories and those real-world examples. So at this point, we're simply waiting to know when a work session will be scheduled for our budget. We typically go late. Our budget is typically worked late because they use us a little bit as cleanup once they have a sense of what resources are available for some of the other Measure 76 eligible agencies. So historically, we've gone late May, early June, so we'll certainly keep you updated about that. Oh, right, and then if you flip over to page 2, forgot that I blended in the PCSRF update here. So again, as a reminder, we have submitted our application for federal funds for the federal fiscal year 17 solicitation for the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Funds. The submission occurred actually in late March. It was due in early April. We requested, as we historically have, the maximum amount of $25 million. We have never gotten the maximum amount, but we like to aim high. So as Rosemary mentioned, obviously there's still some uncertainty about various aspects of the federal budget, so we are staying in close communication with our partners at NOAA, and certainly we'll keep you updated as we learn and know more concrete information about the PCSRF funding. So happy to answer any questions.
Gary Marshall. Renee, can you tell me how these lottery funds, this figure is arrived at, or how, I mean, that's a pretty exact figure. Is that based on like last year's lottery revenues, or is it current year estimates, or how do they come up with that figure?
I may have to ask Executive Director Lofsgarden to help me. So there are projections that occur, forecasts that occur, and projections for both general fund and lottery fund. Beyond that, Maida, is there more magic to it?
That's actually, that's exactly correct. This is Maida Lofsgarden, Executive Director for the lottery funds. It is an automatic 7.5% of lottery revenues based on whatever the current forecast is. So that number will change based on the May forecast that we receive. So when we talk to you about the spending plan, for example, we use the current forecast for this conversation around the spending plan. When we get to July, the numbers will have shifted because the May forecast is then the one that's used to finalize the budget.
Thank you.
Randy Labby, co-chair. I was just curious as to whether there's been much commentary in the session about the impact of this new casino, and if there's been any research as to what that
Can you speak to that,
impact's
Maida?
going to be?
Yeah, Maida Lofsgarden, Executive Director. From our understanding and very, very brief conversations, the largest impact will actually be on other tribal casinos in the state that are within reasonable proximity to the Portland area that will now have a casino that is in much closer proximity. That it will likely not have as big of an impact on lottery revenues because it's just a different type of gambling. But that does remain to be seen. So they have not changed projections at this point in time based on that, to my knowledge, but I think that'll be something that will be watched, and in particular for tribal casinos, I think there's a potentially huge impact.
Any other questions for Renee? Or maybe, yes, Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Renee, on the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund, so we usually submit $25 million application. What's our general allocation been over the last couple of years?
Somewhere between 14 and 15 million. Last year we were at 14.8 million, and we were the highest ranked application last year. So given that, and given that our program has continued to maintain the same composition, I think we would probably be looked upon favorably again. I don't know that it would be at 15 million again.
Okay.
But
thank you.
Hopefully promising.
Maida?
Maida Lofsgarden, just one other comment on that because I don't think there's probably another place on the agenda. Just to let folks know, Will Newhauser, Dan Thorndike, and then Jeff Ovison, who is a grantee, we will be traveling back to Washington, D.C. in mid-May to have a conversation with our congressional delegation, NOAA, and the Office of Management and Budget, specifically about Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund. Along with that, we will be putting out some information that our local grantees and others can use in contacting their congressional delegation members if they so choose. So there is we usually go every other year, and we do kind of a broad reach that talks about Farm Bill and Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund and coastal wetlands grants and a bunch of things. This is a very specific targeted trip. We'll be traveling along with Washington, hopefully Idaho, with support also from California and Alaska in that conversation. And there have also been what they call Dear Colleague letters submitted on both the House side and the Senate side from the western states to their cohorts on the Appropriations Committee specifically about this program as well.
Yes, Dan.
Yeah, so this is Dan. Yeah, regarding that, I mean, I think it does tie into our strategic plan process too, because I mean, it's sort of like the giant salmon in the room, you know, because that would, I think that's something we need to somehow incorporate in the ongoing operation of the agency, because I mean, we do have the certainty of, you know, some degree of lottery funds and some of that, but who knows? I mean, it's always been you know, the PCRS, both an amount and having it at all has always been an issue. And I think it's something we really should address pretty directly and just saying, you know, what if, you know, what would we do? What, you know, rather than just, you know, being totally surprised. Certainly historically, I mean, there were years we were much lower, and one year we were in fact somewhat sort of punished because there'd been some legislative moves that diverted some of the PCRF funds that weren't appreciated by our federal grantors, and that, you know, we've had some ups and downs on that for other reasons too. So I just think it's something that we need to incorporate into that longer term plan in terms of what if, and keep things, you know, keep things going on that. So.
Yeah, great point.
But it should be an interesting trip.
Yeah, we appreciate both of you going. It's a real challenge to keep up with Maida in the underground, and it takes a younger team to go back there with her. Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Just had a quick comment. There are tribal set-asides associated with the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund, and so I think there's opportunity here to engage our tribal partners as well. They stand to lose a significant amount of funding for restoration projects as well, and oftentimes are strategic partners in all of the restoration work that occurs in many basins. So I think there is an opportunity for outreach here, and I'll be circling back with some of my tribal constituents as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions of Renee? Thanks, Jason. Okay, Eric.
Great, thank you. For the record, Eric Hartstein, Senior Policy Coordinator, and Renee covered the budget part of the legislative session, and I'll give a brief update on the policy bills that are making their way through the legislature. So we're about halfway through the session right now, and there was about 2,800 bills that were introduced in the 2017 legislature. And fortunately, there are certain deadlines that apply to sort of winnow down some of those bills. And for bills in policy committees, by April 18th, the bills had to have had a work session and voted out of the committee to which they had been assigned. So this is called a first chamber deadline. And approximately 1,200 of the 2,800 bills did not meet this deadline. So in the committee that they were assigned, no work session was held, and the bill did not move out of that committee. For bills that are in joint committees, Ways and Means is a good example, or in revenue or rules committees, these deadlines do not apply. And a second deadline does apply for other policy bills as they move on to the next chamber, which would be on June 2nd. The bills would have to move out of their respective committees. So at the beginning of the session, OWEB began tracking a number of different bills with relevancy to the agency. First and foremost was our agency bill, House Bill 2327. It will revise OWEB statutes, and a summary of the key points of that bill are found on Attachment A to the staff report. And the bill passed both chambers and was signed into law earlier this month by the governor. And it will have an effect, or it has an effective date of January 1st, 2018. So this will mean that the OWEB board will be growing by one come January, with the addition of a representative from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who will be a non-voting member. Another bill that we are tracking, and Laura brought it up earlier, is House Bill 3249. That's the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program bill, and it was described in greater detail back in October. But really briefly, it establishes the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Commission and the Agricultural Heritage Fund, and directs OWEB to establish programs that provide grants to landowners for working land around succession planning, conservation, management planning, covenants, and working lands easements. And the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Commission is charged with assisting OWEB with the development of a grant program, and recommending policies and priorities, and consulting with OWEB concerning grant applications. And the bill, as it stands right now, really just develops the framework for the program, but does not allocate funding to be used for grants associated with working lands, easements, covenants, and succession planning and the like. So the bill was heard in the House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee and was voted out with a do pass recommendation, and is now in the Ways and Means Subcommittee. And finally, there was a number of other bills that we were tracking since February, and they did not meet that first chamber deadline. So these are bills around limiting landowner liability for restoration actions, using Measure 76 lottery funds to purchase fish counting sonar beams. So all of these and many more are no longer moving forward. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Randy Labby, co-chair. Eric, what happened to the 3 water bills? Are they out of committee? Or?
So I believe you're talking the House Bill 2705 and 2706, and I think there was a 2707. And yes, I think they were all moving forward at this point.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, Courtney, are you coming up, or who's doing the monitoring?
Courtney and me.
Oh, both Courtney.
For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director. So we'll now move to item K2, which is Focused Investment Partnership Monitoring. I will cover the implementation FIP piece of this, and then Courtney will cover the partnership learning work with primarily with the capacity building FIPs, although there is an implementation FIP component. So Rosemary touched on the work by Bonneville Environmental Foundation, or BEF. As a reminder, the board awarded just over $300,000 to BEF last spring to help OWEB structure the framework that we would use to monitor and track progress and really capture those lessons learned from both the implementation FIPs and the capacity building FIPs. So in terms of the work with the implementation FIPs, the focus has really been on how do we establish a framework called a progress monitoring framework that can be applied within the context of all 6 of the implementation FIPs in a way that is consistent and provides the board with the ability to track through time how the FIPs are making progress towards their outcomes, but in a way that really does respect the fact that a FIP down in Ashland Forest is quite different from a Harney Basin wetland FIP. So BEF has used a fantastic approach. Will mentioned it briefly. It's a logic model or a results chain, and basically it starts by capturing the actions that the partnership intends to undertake, and then walks through how does that address threats that may exist in the environment, what are some of those restoration or countable outputs, but then also identifies what are those indicators through time that you would use to measure more of that process and function change within the system, really moving towards those ecological outcomes. So when we shared 2 of the draft results chains with the monitoring subcommittee, the comment that I think Alan said is, this looks like a wiring diagram of something really complicated. So thanks for bringing one. We didn't want to subject the full board to it. So they are really complicated, but I think Will captured it nicely in saying it helps, though, to see where some of that interconnection and interplay is between actions and how you start to really move the needle towards some of those ecological outcomes that we are really aiming to get with the FIP investment. So BEF has developed those draft results chains for each of the 6 implementation FIPs and are working closely with the partnerships to vet those, to really talk through, is this what you are aiming to do in terms of your actions? Are these the right measures based on your on-the-ground experience that you would expect to track to really look at some of those outcomes? And the next step in that process is then to take the monitoring work that each of the FIPs propose and crosswalk that to determine if we know we want to track this particular indicator, does the monitoring that was proposed get you there, or are there potentially some monitoring gaps? So ultimately, the product of this first push with BEF is to have well-established progress monitoring frameworks or results chains for each of the 6 implementation FIPs, and then have a sense, are there monitoring gaps that might need to be filled? So really giving the tools to track progress and to flag for the partnership and potentially the board if there might be additional monitoring requests coming from the FIPs to ensure that you'll have the information to track FIP progress through time. So we had always planned to have BEF come and report to the board in July. What we have started talking about with them, because it's it's pretty complicated stuff, is potentially a staged presentation starting in July to really help the board wrap your heads around what this progress monitoring framework is, but then have some additional time as follow-up in October to delve a little bit deeper into it, given that this is critical to tracking the new FIP program, but also this type of outcomes tracking, I think, potentially could be quite relevant to other work that the board might propose or consider in the future, depending on the strategic plan conversations and how those develop, and telling the story of restoration. We think it's likely a good investment of time to consider a staged July and October presentation and interaction with BEF on this. So I'll pause there, see if you have questions about the implementation piece before we jump to the capacity building FIPS.
Okay.
Okay, the wiring diagram scared everyone, Alan.
I'm sorry. John.
Oh, sorry, John.
Just so I understand, John Roberts, what is, are we going to get a report fairly frequently at every board meeting, or semi-annually, or whatever? And then, to me, you know, it's important to understand if things aren't working as they're supposed to. You know, how are we going to redirect efforts, or what options will we have, and how do we, you know, move the focus to accomplish what we had put the money out for? Not that I think it'll happen, but I think we need a fallback.
Yeah. So both great questions. In terms of frequency, we haven't quite nailed that down yet because we're still in the development of the framework, and we have to determine, depending on what those indicators are, what's the appropriate frequency. There likely would be some things that would see annual monitoring that would warrant an, you know, semi-annual, annual update. There might be other parameters, somewhat more complicated ones, that might need a few years of monitoring to be able to start to see, obviously, any kind of trend or real indication of how that's working. So that'll be part of the work with the partnerships once the results changed or finalized, is determining what the monitoring is, and then when can we report at what frequency to the board about that progress. The second, do you want to add something now?
This is Maida. I might add one other piece that I think a note of concern that has come from some of our grantees. When you look at the results chain that Alan just showed, some of the things that are being monitored won't have results until way after our funding goes away. And so I think there's a concern a little bit from our grantees that what we don't want to do is make them do a 180 in their projects when there are very few things, and this is what we're learning, that really are going to fit within our 6-year time frame for monitoring. So it may not be that it may be that the very early actions that we're funding are perfect, and it's what they're doing down the road that might change. So we are learning a lot that what we can see in 6 years is very small compared to what their results chain looks like.
But is the notion, though, then, at least this, Dan, to at least at the beginning of the process get the framework in there that could theoretically continue for
Absolutely.
a
Yes.
long time?
Yep. And that's the beauty, really, of how it's structured, is it has those near-term, midterm, and longer-term measures. So there certainly will be some that are more appropriate for measuring how the system starts to move. Others, and that was part of the options for redirecting. I think that when you hear from BEF in July, the implementation FIPS have been very frank about some of those challenges that Maida just mentioned, and I think that'll be part of the sensitivity of this conversation, is we don't want to prematurely penalize any of the FIPS if we're not seeing movements in some measures that do take 5, 10, 15, 20
Right,
years even.
And again, I mean, I think making that really clear up front, not only for their comfort, but also from a sort of political perspective, to try to continue that education that you can't expect some of these things to happen within the normal political even time frame, because that's always been a problem with a lot of the projects. Well, nothing's happened, and we gave you money 2 years ago. Come on, you know. So,
Yep.
so I think that's good to make that more obvious.
And one other piece, this may be a little bit more qualitative than quantitative, but Eric Williams just recently started participating in the FIP monitoring calls with BEF. And our intent with that is to determine, are there some qualitative lessons learned that we can begin to capture to complement the quantitative monitoring and measurement that we're doing that might help to maybe predict some of those refinements that might be needed to the program as we continue with its implementation through time? And are there some proactive things that we want to help folks, applicants, think about on the front end with how might you walk through a results chain, or how might you structure your monitoring differently to have that range of measures that cover different timeframes? So I think that that conversation about early lessons learned can be helpful too, to inform the program over time.
Yeah, Gary.
This is Gary. Renee, is there any of these FIPS that have projects that have that already have some monitoring that was ongoing with them before, and that has some data behind them to start with already?
Yeah, I'm quickly racking my brain, Gary. I think all of them certainly have some monitoring, whether it really crosswalks with some of the key elements identified in the results chain. That may not always be the case, but I think of the Upper Grand Run, Rosemary works really frequently with them. They have a long established monitoring program, and so they were able to really jump right into the results chain work. I think they might find a few things here and there that they might want to do some additional monitoring to complement it and make sure they can track through time, but we have some really great foundational monitoring to build on with the FIPS.
Okay.
Okay, for the record, Courtney Schaff, Capacity Programs Coordinator. And I'll give you a very brief update on the Partnership Learning Project because you'll hear more about it at the July board meeting. So the objective of the Partnership Learning Project is we are working with BEF and an additional consultant, Jennifer Arnold from Reciprocity Consulting. And we're really looking at getting some lessons learned about how the partnerships are working together, both the capacity building and the implementation FIPS. How are they working through the process? What are the things that are working well? What are the challenges? So that we can make any revisions to the program as we move forward to continue to improve and offer the best possible avenue to get to for these types of funds. So at the July board meeting, you will hear a draft report or a preliminary report that focuses just on the capacity building FIPS. Because the implementation FIPS have been so busy with implementation, we have held off engaging with them, and the engagement includes a survey, phone interviews, and visiting a meeting. And the consultant has focused her work on the capacity building FIPS. She is finishing up all of that work, which is the surveys and the meetings and the phone calls, at the end of this month, and writing a draft report. We're giving all the capacity building FIPS an opportunity to review that report before the operating capacity subcommittee will see it, and then there'll be a full presentation to the board in July. We are getting a high-level report. Each of the individual organizations, if they opt in, gets a individual presentation from the consultant about, this is what I heard when we did the interviews and the survey. These are the things that I learned about your partnership. But that information's all being rolled up with, so we're not knowing that Partnership X said this and Partnership Y said that, so that there's more confidentiality and there's really a level of trust between the consultant on each of these partnerships. So we're getting really good information without OWEB knowing who said what. So we're really excited about it. A lot of great lessons learned, a lot of engagement from all the partnerships, and you'll have an opportunity to really kind of hear what the lessons learned are and how the program is working in July. Are there any questions?
Okay, Courtney, thanks, and Renee, thanks. We're going to move over to item R, other business. Is there any other business to come before the board?
Yes. There are, this is Maida Lofsgaard, we have 2 items of other business that are at the end of your blue folder. So the last 2 items in your blue folder, which one is a revised Coquille Valley Wetlands Protection Restoration Project, and then item R2, which is CREP cost share. So the very last 2 sheets of paper in your blue folder. And Eric is jumping in on behalf of Jillian, who will be so excited that she doesn't have to come up and do these 2 items.
Thank you, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Eric Williams, Grant Program Manager at OWEB. And I am always happy to talk about the Coquille Valley Wetlands Protection and Restoration Project, which is the subject of agenda item R1 under other business. This is a fairly large scale and quite impactful project in the Coquille Valley that incorporates both working lands and tidal wetland restoration. At the end of the proposed project, we expect to restore 400 acres of tidal wetlands there. However, it's a complex undertaking because the water flow is currently regulated by a failing tide gate, which, as you know and have heard from previous board presentations, are pieces of fairly expensive infrastructure. And in this case, the tide gate that impacts China Camp Creek allows the farming to go on there, needs to be replaced. And the kind of symbiotic relationship here is that there are restoration goals that can be accomplished on land that's currently owned by ODFW, as well as working lands goals that can be accomplished by the farmer members of the Beaver Slough Drainage District down there. But they have to work together to do this, and they have been for a number of years. The challenge that we're currently trying to deal with is that this project was initially scoped several years ago based on 30% project designs, and then had to go through additional design work and, of course, permitting activities, as well as compiling what the Beaver Slough Drainage District has tallied as 21 separate funding sources to fund this extensive project. What you see in the staff report under the funding history section, which is section 2, is a history of OWEB board actions related to this project, including in 2012, $1 million in coastal wetlands funding, federal funding, that were allocated to the restoration portion of the project, which is commonly referred to as Winter Lake Restoration Project. And you see in the first table there are 2 grants to the Nature Conservancy there, with some funds that have not yet been obligated, representing that third row of $270,000. And then on page 2, you'll see that in 2013, the board delegated authority to the director for the lottery funds that matched that federal award, which was then provided in 2 grants to the Nature Conservancy as shown there. Then subsequent to that, there were additional board actions to fund the tide gate portion of this through the Beaver Slough Drainage District. Those 2 actions that are highlighted here have been delegated to the executive director, but we do not currently have grant agreements for those funds in terms of the $515,000 to the Beaver Slough Drainage District, and then the second one is a coastal wetlands project in the amount of $920,000. So with that as background, the reason that we're coming to you today is to make some adjustments to your prior authorizations on this project. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a long history of collaborative work on this project and a regulatory process, as well as a funding process with multiple funders that has resulted, by the time that the work was put out to bid over this past winter, in pretty high figures for those bids that are well above and beyond what had previously been allocated in all of those funding sources. There are efforts going on now by the project partners. One promising one is working with ODOT to obtain over $1 million in mitigation funds that after some meetings on site with ODOT, they are very interested in participating in funding this project. So we think we can get there in terms of getting to the total dollars needed for the project. This request entails potentially having to go to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to ask for some adjustments to prior awarded coastal wetlands funds, and also potentially adjusting the resulting grant agreements from both the coastal wetlands funds and our prior lottery awards. And we don't yet know exactly how that is going to shake out. We're still working with project partners to line that out precisely. This request is to give us the flexibility, if needed, to take those prior awards that the board made and potentially consolidate them and enter into new grant agreements, either for the infrastructure side, which is a muted tide gate regulator, or the restoration side, which entails reestablishing the former tidal channels that used to exist in Winter Lake. That is a pretty, I think, complicated discussion, but it's actually way more complicated than that. This, as I mentioned, if this request is approved by the board, it basically gives us the flexibility to move different pieces around based on what might come in the door. As an example, if the ODOT mitigation funds come through, but they say we will only use that money for the tidal channel restoration portion, we may then need to move some of these funds that we had allocated for that tidal channel restoration portion fund into the tide gate replacement portion. But we don't know yet whether or not we're going to need to do that. We have communicated with the service. Jillian actually heard today a favorable response from them. They're fully invested in making sure this project goes forward. They are amenable to making some changes to their prior awards to accommodate the need that has arisen due to the budget increases and the potential other funding sources and how they may shake out. So we're very encouraged by that, and we hope to have an answer to all of this by mid-May, when the Beaver Slough Drainage District would give the go-ahead to its earth-moving contractors to start work down there. So it's also fairly time-sensitive, and despite the complexities of it, I remain optimistic that we will get there to the finish line.
This is Will Newhouser. So this is, just to confirm, so no change to the dollar amounts. It's just to provide flexibility in how those get allocated among the various pieces of the project.
That is correct. There would be no change to the dollar amounts,
And
to the total dollar amount.
right. The original, so does that include going all the way back to 2012?
It does.
So is there any issue with how long, from a time of an award to when it has to be dispensed, that fits into this also? Because unless it all gets spent this, I don't know how long that lasts
Right.
or whatever.
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is comfortable with the timeline, and the lottery portion of it we could deal with by, if the lottery funds are getting too stale and need to be spent, we can allocate those funds to other projects and then use newer year lottery money to backfill this project.
Okay.
This is Randy. We'll take some questions. Alan, did you have a question?
I did, but Will.
It's okay. Okay. Any further questions? Okay, we'll see if we can take some action. We have a
This is Will. I move the board authorize the executive director to amend or consolidate grant scopes and funding amounts for the Coquille Valley Wetlands Protection and Restoration Project, including project numbers 211-115, 215-2000, and 215-8006, as needed by the project partners and authorized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with an effective date of April 28th, 2015.
Is there?
Dan seconds.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further question?
That's effective as of 2 years ago?
Yes.
Yeah.
We confirmed that, yes.
All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay. Eric?
This one, Eric, or do you want me, you got this one?
Yeah.
Sure.
Approve
Declaring
something.
it passed.
It's like a little time warp.
Yeah, time warp.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Co-chairs, members of the board, again, Eric Williams, for the record, Grant Program Manager. This item is R2 under other business regarding CREP cost share. OWEB participates in the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program by providing cost share funds to landowners who choose to voluntarily implement riparian restoration practices on their properties. The OWEB share of eligible practices is 25%, and the Farm Services Agency, the federal source, contributes 50%, with the landowner contributing the remaining 25%. Because this is a voluntary program and the partners run sign-up periods for this, and we can't always predict, or we can't ever really predict exactly how many requests are going to come through. We estimate what to include in the spending plan to provide Oregon's share of this state, federal, local partnership. And occasionally the requests come in higher than the amount of funds that have been allocated for it. In this biennium, we had $500,000 in the spending plan to cover landowner cost share. And as of this month, we have spent down all of those funds and expect that some additional payments will be coming in. So in order to make those cost share payments and comply with the terms of our cost share agreements, we're proposing to utilize $200,000 of recaptured state lottery funds to add to the CREP cost share line item. And I'll take any questions if anyone has.
Okay, this is Randy, co-chair. Alan?
This is Alan. Eric, if those funds aren't used, you're saying you don't know if more requests would come in, and likely going to be more requests coming in. But if they don't, do those funds go back to, or do they stay with CREP funding?
They would be recaptured if they're not used.
They wouldn't be
No, that is not the case. Sorry,
case.
Eric.
Okay.
So the way, this is Maida, the way that we operate the CREP program is just a little bit different. So we estimate, as Eric mentioned, that $500,000, we estimated that would carry us through to the end of the biennium. Typically it does. We're actually, the $200,000 that we're asking for is probably easily more than what we'll use between now and the end of June. We will move that money forward. And so basically what it does is keeps us as a rolling, so we try really hard to never zero that one out. So the $200,000 would stay in this program. We'll be asking you for, I think, another $500,000 for next 600,000.
Right.
And that's because what we're seeing is those numbers are a little bit higher. So the 200,000 will stay in.
Okay.
We'll ask you for another 600, but basically that just keeps us rolling. And so the biennium after, we may only ask you for 400 because we're not using up the whole. So and it is because it's such a funky program. Like this set of requests that came in this time that zeroed us out were completely, we just didn't expect them to come. We never know from FSA what's going to come or not.
Rosemary.
This is Rosemary. So where there's 200,000 recaptured funds, are there other recaptured funds? Is there a large pool sitting out there that this is taking 200 out of more money that's available? That I'm not sure I have the full.
This is Maida, and yes, there is, and so what we typically do with recaptured funds, although we've done other things with them in the past, but typically that they go into your next biennium's budget. So when we talk about the $80 and $85 million in the spending plan, Cindy in our office is assuming recaptured dollars as a part of that. So there is a bigger amount. This is very small compared to your entire budget, and so this isn't going to have an impact on any of the items in your spending plan. It's kind of, I don't want to say this in a bad way, but it's a fairly small blip in what happens with recaptured funds. And so then basically that is an adjustment that we make based on the May revenue forecast for new money and then recaptured dollars that come in. So there is a bigger amount there. Sometimes you will use that when you want to fund a project below the funding line. Recaptured dollars are what we would use for that. And again, if not used, then we put them into the next biennium spending plan.
Gary?
This is Gary. Can you tell me if any of these funds apply to re-enrollment in CREP programs, or this is all to initial first-time CREP?
Yes, both.
Both.
If there are no further questions, we'll have request for a motion.
Like a motion? I move that the board add this is Dan. I move the board add $200,000 of recaptured funds to the CREP line item of the 2015-17 spending plan and delegate to the executive director the authority to distribute the funds through appropriate agreements with an award date of July 1, 2015, which moves us up from an effective date of April 28, 2015. So we're moving forward.
A second, this is Will.
Motions and second. Any further question? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. That's carried. And this is Randy, co-chair. We still have 10 minutes until we're supposed to adjourn, so we'll take 10 minutes of one of the breaks tomorrow, and we'll be adjourned.
Okay.
Logistics, Derica, any logistics we need to know?